As I looked at the mountain of urine-filled plastic bottles on my desk, Sergeant Friedlander peered over his horn-rimmed glasses. "See, they're all labelled with the name and unit." He went on to explain that there were several American Army bases in the Stuttgart area, and all military personnel had to supply urine samples. Drug addiction was a real problem with American soldiers fighting the war in Vietnam, especially as time went on and there seemed no end to the conflict. If they weren't drug addicted before they were drafted, as many were, they soon began to rely on drugs to tolerate the horrors of a war they often knew little about. Marijuana was common and easily attainable in Vietnam, but when these young, vulnerable soldiers were being arrested for using this particular drug, they began reaching for harder stuff such as heroin, opium, and LSD in order to cope with the brutal effects of PTSD. These drugs were less detectable, but much more addictive and damaging. 6 months before I acquired my new job, in an effort to deal with the drug problem and rehabilitate soldiers returning from Vietnam, President Nixon had ordered a drug urinalysis program for all military personnel. Civilians were exempt. The kind and patient Sergeant Friedlander handed me a notebook and explained that I needed to log in all names and serial numbers and then send the bottles off to an independent German lab in Landstuhl, where the samples were tested for illicit drugs. I then had to check the report, and if there were positive results, Sergeant Friedlander contacted the Army unit, and the soldiers were hospitalized upstairs in the drug ward on the 3rd floor. This was where Pat worked. These heroin-addicted soldiers spent 2 weeks on the ward to clean up their act. 2 weeks to become drug-free. Now, even though I wasn't particularly savvy about drug addiction, common sense told me that it took a lot longer than 14 days to kick the habit. Every day the addicts came down to the lab to submit their urine samples. Some of them were in various stages of drug withdrawal, and it was painful to see them in such distress. Each soldier had to be supervised as they peed into a plastic bottle. Thankfully, that wasn't part of my job, but it was Sergeant Friedlander's. However, he was too embarrassed and humiliated to stand watching each soldier, so he looked away, which gave the GIs an opportunity to substitute someone else's urine. I later learned that an orderly on the drug ward, Carter, who was often accompanied the soldiers into the lab, was not only providing the addicts with his urine, but also supplying them with the drugs they needed, for a price, naturally. Consequently, the drug abuse program was a complete farce and an exercise in futility, as was the therapy group I was part of later. Most narcotics were pretty plentiful in Germany, and hashish, or hash, was particularly popular among the GIs. "Want to smoke a bowl?" was a frequent refrain. I didn't have a clue what that meant, but a bowl actually meant pipe, but instead of smoking tobacco, hash was preferred, which apparently was about 3 times stronger than marijuana. A week or so after Pat and I had settled into our rooms, we decided to cook a meal in our communal kitchen for Randy and Mike to repay them for giving us a lift and changing our lives. After the meal, they all tried their hardest to get me to smoke a bowl of hash. I'd never smoked a cigarette, hated it, and even though I did try to smoke the hash, my lungs hurt so much I knew it just wasn't worth it. "What we having for dessert?" Randy asked. "Strawberry cheesecake," I told him. He jumped up. "I'll get it." A couple of minutes later, he returned with a big piece of cheesecake on a plate. "Eat that and see what happens." I tentatively took a bite, and instead of the creamy texture I expected, it was gritty. That was the hash that Randy had mixed into the dessert. It wasn't the most pleasant of tastes, but I was encouraged to persevere, and I ate most of it. Randy, Mike, and Pat sat there looking at me, waiting for me to react. But nothing happened for about half an hour. Then it kicked in, and I was saying, apparently, the silliest things. I do remember something about having a chicken on my head. Anyway, whatever I said made everyone roll around laughing. It certainly was a fun experience, but I didn't intend to make a habit of it. Captain Cartwright walked into the office just as the phone rang. I picked it up. "Good morning. Laboratory service. Can I help you?" "Is this the lab?" a female voice said. "Yes." "Is the captain there?" "Who's calling?" "Woody." I handed the phone to Cartwright and said, "It's Woody for you." She smirked at me and guffawed into the phone. "Yeah, she sure is a marble mouth." Then she laughed out loud. From then on, I was always called Marble Mouth by Cartwright and her sidekick Woody, a small, stick-thin, feisty woman who worked at the other end of the corridor in the chemistry lab alongside Randy. They actually liked my English accent, but really enjoyed hearing me pronounce laboratory. I tried saying it with an American accent, laboratory, but it sounded like lavatory to me. So I decided to just say lab to make it easy for everyone. At lunchtime, Pat came down to meet me in the lab, and Randy, still wearing a cast on his arm, took us over to the mess hall, a huge, crowded and noisy American-style cafeteria filled with military personnel and civilians. As I moved along the lunch line, my eyes locked with those of a gorgeous man with skin like polished ebony as he dropped a canister of chili into a steam tray. He then turned and walked back into the kitchen. As we slowly shuffled along the line towards the desserts, I was just about to pick up a piece of apple pie when the gorgeous man was there again, handing me a slice of carrot cake. "This is better," he said. As our hands touched, I felt as if I'd been struck by lightning. Then he smiled and I almost melted. Okay, I know, it all sounds very much like a Harlequin romance novel, and apologies for the cliches, but honestly, it was love at first sight with Dave, who was one of the mess hall cooks. Even though I glimpsed him from time to time when I went to lunch with the gang from the lab, we never spoke, not until the following Saturday. This was when Pat and I and our new friends Therese from Ireland and Catherine from Liverpool went to the NCO club with a few of the guys. The club was on the hospital grounds, and on Saturdays there was usually a band, or if not, a DJ playing music. As you can imagine, we were never short of male company, and I have to say how polite they all were. For instance, whenever one of the girls got up from the table to go to the bathroom, all the men rose in unison, almost as if they were going with us. It was cute. It didn't occur to me until later, but we were all white at our table, Caucasian, and across the other side of the room was a table where all of the guys were black, including Dave. My stomach did a flip when I saw him. The band was on a break, and an Al Green song was playing, "Let's Stay Together." Dave sauntered over to our table and asked me to dance, and I was thrilled. We had a great time dancing together, and then eventually he took me back to the table. And when I sat down, I noticed that the guys were very quiet. Later, as my relationship with Dave developed and I became friendly with other black military, including the race relations officer and his family, I seem to have got myself a reputation of being a lover of the black race, although that wasn't quite how they expressed it. I didn't understand. These were all Americans in the army, and some had fought alongside one another in Vietnam. As someone once put it, the only colour in the jungle is green. This was my first introduction to racism in the military, but not my last. Next time you'll hear more about antics in the lab and the insane drug therapy group. Thanks for listening.